Content Podcast, episode 160. Contemporary dance artist, choreographer, director, programmer, creative facilitator, and producer, Shannon Litzenberger.
And we are in a very unstable environment right now. We don't have to be change makers. Change is happening. It is happening quickly, and the pace of change is accelerating. So this plan and execute way of engaging with the world is less and less relevant. And so building this capacity to play and improvise and allow for emergent possibilities to arise is a kind of new leadership capacity that makes more sense in the context of the world as it is in this moment.
This is a follow-up conversation with Shannon, picking up on our exchange on December 8th, 2021, in Toronto, episode 90, State of Emergence, Why We Need Artists Right Now. Now let's fast forward 2.5 years to our second conversation, this time about the impact of the State of Emergency essay and updates from Shannon's latest projects. And you'll hear that Shannon's perspectives are decidedly feminist, philosophical, and socially conscious. And her views are informed by her roots in Canada's rural prairies, which inspire her connection to land, environment, belonging, identity, and place. When I sat down with Shannon in her home in Toronto, we talked about a new essay she's working on, which I'm very excited about, on the theme of leadership at the end of the world. But the conversation was not all gloom and doom, in spite of being the end of the world as we know it. Quite au contraire, Shannon is working on developing a concept called culture of collective thriving. And she's walking her talk, I know because I took a workshop with her. And she's integrating art practice into everything she does. And so her belief in art is inspiring and I think very effective. As per usual, at the end of each conversation, I ask my guest what they're reading, and Shannon mentions Embodied Activism by Ray Johnson and Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey. Hey Shannon, welcome back.
Thank you.
When I say welcome back, I mean we did episode 90 together, 3 years ago. And so this is my second conversation with a guest. And of course, you and I talk regularly about all kinds of things, arts policy and embodiment, and I've actually done some workshops with you. But the idea today is to think a bit about what we talked about before, because you wrote a paper and it's been circulating. Of course, you've done a lot of things since then. But let's start with just reminding people your background, who you are, and then we'll talk for about half an hour or so.
That sounds good. Well, yes, so I am a dance artist, a choreographer, director, and embodiment facilitator, and I work a lot in sort of these intersecting spaces of art making, leadership development, and systems change work.
And you are a writer, of course, and a thinker and a doer, and somebody who's concerned about environmental issues, obviously, but also their interconnection with other things. So what is, maybe we'll start with the paper, remind people what it was, the piece that you wrote, and what kind of impact has it had?
Yeah, I wrote an essay called State of Emergence, Why We Need Artists Right Now, because I was frustrated during the pandemic about how artists were being treated and maybe more importantly, not just how artists were being treated, but by how we were kind of ignoring art as a way of knowing the world and the gifts of creative process that artists bring to moments of crisis, moments of radical social transformation. And so that paper was written in three parts, and the first part was speaking about, how are artists being viewed in society right now, and are we actually mobilizing the creative gifts of artists in this moment, and reflecting on issues of declining mental health and increasing precarity, and perhaps also a bit of a reflection on the state of the artist in society in this moment. And then I also talk about in the paper the process of creation that made Canada. So this idea of Canada as a nation being a process of creation that created a lot of harm, and that is something that we as a country need to reflect on and think about as we move forward, about how do we actually build a more pluralistic society that's reflective of the beautiful diversity of our country, and also that acknowledges the harms to Indigenous peoples and other marginalized identities in our society. And then the last part of the essay is about the potential of artists as world makers. And I use this term world making as a way of signaling that we are always in a process of creating worlds, and that world making process is a culture making process. So it's the codes of belonging that we adhere to. It's the rituals, it's the practices and behaviors that bind us together, and that artists are often working with these practices, and often in this practice of world making as a way of imagining in public what the world might
be. And what has been the response?
So I was really heartened by the response to this essay, in part because the first people who reached out to me were other artists. And I heard from many other artists who said to me, I've been thinking about this too. And I think that is maybe in my heart a bit of the response that I was interested in, that I wanted to, some of these things I was thinking about are hard things, and also reflective of like a challenging, increasing challenges of just being an independent artist in society. And so there was this kind of resonant, me too, yes, this is what I'm feeling as well, that I heard from other artists. And so there were a number of things that unfolded from the publication of that paper. One is that I was invited to share it more broadly. So I participated in a lot of panels and conversations. And as a way of honoring some of the, points I was trying to make in the essay, I really insisted that it not be a series of keynote addresses, but actually a series of conversations with other artists. So in the ways that it was shared, I often had the opportunity to be in dialogue with other artists who read it and added their own thoughts to the discussion, and that felt like a very rich engagement with the content. Another thing that happened is that I started to think about the paper as a work of art itself, and engaged it in a kind of creative process. So there were a number of instances where there was a kind of dinner party hosted and a collective reading of the essay among artists, so that it was a bit of an embodied experiment in a way to like put the words of the essay, even though they're my words, to put the words in the voices and bodies of other artists, and to then have a conversation, a reflective conversation around how that felt. How does it feel to speak the words of this essay, and where in your own body were there resonances or dissonances or other things that came up? And that made for a very rich set of conversations as well, that were sort of in, semi-private spaces and, around dinner tables, for example. And then the last thing maybe I'll offer is that this essay was also a catalyst for the creation of the Public Imagination Network, which is a group of 8 specific artists, so including myself, Sherry Boyle, Greg Frankson, Devyani Saltzman, Evelyn Perry, Kevin Loring, Kevin Ormsby, and Leslie Ting. So all of us are artists that come from different disciplinary backgrounds. They were all artists who really resonated with the essay in its initial offer. And we have been, over the last year, in an ongoing conversation as artists about how creative practice, can be a response to issues of public governance and social justice. And it's been a really interesting, series of conversations, really. Like that's kind of how we think of ourselves, is an interesting conversation, because as a network we're coming together but really resisting some of the old models and structures. Like, we're not thinking about ourselves as an organization or an entity that has a perspective on the world, but a series of individuals who have individual perspectives that are coming into conversation with each other. So we've been meeting on a monthly basis over the last year. We are also in a process of doing some more writing. And there will be, down the line, some public events that will also happen. But it's very much in process right now, and evolving with each conversation.
Well, when I read the paper, I thought everybody should read it, and similar types of, it's a type of manifesto in the sense that it's a call to action. It's also a plea, I guess, for the recognition of the contribution of artists coming out of COVID, and it still is very hard for artists to make a living and to play the role that we need them to play. So I thought it was important. So people can listen to our episode 90 conversation to hear more about it. But thanks for the update, because here you are doing other things now, interconnected inevitably. So what are you up to now?
Well, many things, as always. Anyone who knows me knows that I've always, got a lot of things going on at once. But I guess a couple of things that are really in the foreground for me right now are my embodied practice and leading embodied workshops. In particular, I've been leading a lot of workshops around embodied ensemble-based play. And these workshops are connected to a piece of research that I'm doing, funded by the Canada Council for the Arts Strategic Innovation Program. I actually have two different projects I'm doing with funding support from the Canada Council in this series of programs. So the one is with my dance artist colleague, Mairead Filgate. And this was the workshop that you did, Claude, or one of them anyways. So she and I have been really looking at this question of how embodied ensemble play contributes to developing capacity for collective leadership. And so we've been running a series of practice-based workshops where we are also expanding our practice offerings of embodiment, ensemble-based embodied practice, with groups of individuals that range from theater and dance artists, but also like other types of folks who don't have backgrounds in the arts necessarily. And we're sort of tracking what happens when people come together and work in non-verbal ways in improvised collaboration. What happens? What kind of community gets created? And so far, the impact of these workshops has been really interesting for us. Really demonstrating that there is a deep need right now to be in community in ways that are caring, in ways that are playful, in ways that are joyful, in ways that are about being together as much as doing together, and that there's a bit of an absence of these opportunities right now. So even just in that very baseline kind of way, bringing people together to play joyfully has an amazing impact on our sense of well-being and strengthens our mental health, I think, in this moment where there's just a lot of burnout
and disconnection and sense of isolation through media and through all kinds of things that you're but of course it's specialized process, right? So it's but we were saying earlier that a lot of our bodies are numb, at least mine is, and I do qigong every day to try to loosen things up, and people do whatever makes sense to them. But to get together, you can experience art, but you can also participate in moving yourself and getting to know yourself. And the connection to cultural leadership is interesting because when I did that workshop with you, we were doing very simple but very profound gestures and whatever you want to call it. And it was like, and you use it practically in leadership training, right?
Exactly. So I've been working in the space of leadership development for over a decade now, and over time, through many collaborations with many others, have been developing a kind of framework and set of practices for how to build collective leadership, but in particular, working with and through the body. Because in this world that's a hyper rationalist society where we believe that we think with our heads and that that we don't believe that we think with and through our bodies, which is actually way more the case, that we make sense of our world and we come into relationship with our world with and through us as bodies, that this is actually a really potent methodology for thinking about culture change. If we want to move away from a world that has a very top-down, head-centric approach to leadership and into a world that is much more relational and acknowledges leadership as a productive dynamic that arises between people and that works in service to collective thriving, that this is a process that we need to engage with in an embodied way. So that's really been a central question in my work and has been fueling this emergent methodology and framework that I've been working with. And maybe I'll speak to that a bit through another collaboration that is also really significant in my world right now, which is a collaboration through a collective called Wild Soma. So there's 4 of us who are all quite seasoned, dance artists and embodiment practitioners, myself, Rula Saeed, Julia Aplin, and Andrea Nan. So the 4 of us came together under the banner of Wild Soma in 2021 to explore this question of embodied world making. So here's this world making word again that's coming up. And through, engagement with our shared practices, and each of us, applies embodied practice in different ways. My application is more in the field of leadership development, but for others, it's also in like processes of healing, processes of building inclusive practice for people with different, that come from, different social locations and different levels of abilities and things like that, and also practices that are very ecocentric that relate to working with trees and in the natural world. And so there's just like a richness of practice that's coming together through the collaboration between the 4 of us. And so we made a proposal, again, through this Canada Council's strategic initiatives, to work with 8 different organizations around questions of culture change. So each organization that we're partnering with has identified a question that they want to explore using embodied practice methodologies. And so over the next year and a half, we will be designing and collaborating on the design of interventions using embodied practice that are aimed at shifting culture in these organizations. And the shift in the culture is really about centering care, centering equity, centering wellness. And these things are a bit antithetical to the modalities that organizations have been working in, and especially in this environment. Like in the proposal of, bigger, better, more, progress and growth, then there's just this intense doubling down of working harder and harder and harder in the same ways, and not really acknowledging the way that ultimately is exploiting us as human beings in the name of what? Like in the name of organizational missions, that are less and less human centric. And so, in the realm of leadership development, this framework that I've been working on, again, very much in collaboration with others, has been, right now it has sort of 4 parts to it. And when I design workshops, using embodied practice, I use this framework as a guide. And so these 4 parts, I'll just name them. The first is around sensory attunement. The second part is around attentional awareness. The third is around relating and resonating. And the fourth is around embodied ensemble-based play. So in this framework, it's an invitation into the body as a way of knowing the world, thinking with and through the body, attending to the world in ways that are inclusive of the foreground and the background, like understanding a wider field of view that understands the dynamics that produce the effects that are unfolding in front of us, and then working toward a kind of right relationship. And I feel like that third one is really key in the conversation around the ecological crisis as well, because this is being really conscious about what our relationship is with ourselves, each other, and our world, and balancing that. Like, right relationship is understanding, like, what are we as energetic bodies transmitting out into the world, and what are we receiving as antennae, as receptors of that energy, and trying to calibrate how we offer our gifts and exercise our agency in the world, but balancing that with a responsibility and service to the collective. That's a really key part of this framework. And then this other element of play, I mean, this has really been the most fun part because play is the opposite of it's the opposite of plan and execute. So, in organizational culture, we're so imbued in this world of plan and execute. But that model really relies on a more stable environment. And we are in a very unstable environment right now. We don't have to be change makers. Change is happening. It is happening quickly, and the pace of change is accelerating. So this plan and execute way of engaging with the world is less and less relevant. And so building this capacity to play and improvise and allow for emergent possibilities to arise is a kind of new leadership capacity that makes more sense in the context of the world as it is in this moment.
Or a mix and match of some long-term planning, but with a reality check of what this world, because the world as we know it is ending, and that's one of the themes of this season, right? Because that's not an idea I came up with. It's gesturing towards Decolonial Futures Collective and others who talk about this. And it's a good thing. I just was talking with Jane Marsland yesterday, and she said it's good that the world that we know, that we've built, that is so unsustainable, ends.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that all life on Earth will end, and hopefully humans will find a way to reinvent themselves, because we're on a bad path now, a path of everything you said. So what else is on your radar that we would want to know about in terms of your thinking, or some of the... by the way, there's a really lovely podcast conversation that I listened to, I think, on community radio here in Toronto.
Yes.
What was that one called?
Turnout Radio.
That's
right. Yeah, I did do an interview recently with Turnout Radio and Nicole Inika Hamilton, who's the wonderful host there, and we talked about care and embodiment and a little bit about leadership practice as well.
So I'll put the link to that in the episode notes, because you can't recreate certain conversations. It was very warm and caring, and you talked about some very personal things, and it's so interesting to hear people take the time to have a conversation and not feel so rushed that you have to get that little bite or whatever. In a way, the world needs to slow down, and yet we need to accelerate our action and accelerate change. That's why I'm asking about the impact, because I'm actually not seeing as much impact as I would have liked to seen from your paper. I would love people, not just you, but people who are trying to be change makers by facilitating it, by doing workshops, by writing, by provoking ideas. Why isn't it being picked up in a more important way? Like, why aren't there transformation going on? Now, my theory is that it is happening, but it's not connected. Because people are concerned, they're doing what they can through their art practice, through their organizational structures, but we don't know. It's a big country. How do we know about each other? So that connecting piece is really important. I do a little bit through the podcast, but my question remains. Is there anything else you want to tell
Yeah.
us about?
Well, maybe I'll just say there's a bit of a paradox in this moment where, for someone like me, in a lot of ways, I've kind of gotten off the highway of the institutional structure for a while to really try to think well, outside of agendas of institutions and imperatives of institutional survival. And that has helped me be very clear for myself about what I see happening in this moment and what I think needs to happen going forward in order to, adapt to this epic change. As you said, it's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel like institutions are very tied to an old story, and their mandates are first and foremost to survive. And so there's an orientation toward an old world, but it's getting harder and harder and harder. And so we're seeing, people leaving the field. We're seeing increasing rates of burnout. We're seeing, a challenge to adapt to that. And so what I feel is exciting about sort of being off the highway in a way is just to have a clearer picture and to not be bound to a way of doing things that made sense in the old world, but to actually start to work on processes and practices that will build capacity for a world yet to come. And that is really where my vision is right now, where I'm directing my energy. And I don't have control over whether or not institutions are going to pay attention to that or a wider world is going to pay attention to that. But I do feel quite compelled to continue writing and talking about this because, as I experienced with the first essay, it's like a beacon in the world that is looking for resonance, and there is resonance out there. And I feel it when I put these messages out into the world. And so right now I'm working on a new essay. It's still very much in draft, but I spent a period of time at my family home in Saskatchewan, kind of in the dead of winter. Most of the month of February I was out there. And it was a very profound time because I was actually in a very deep process of grieving. I lost a friend and my primary research collaborator, Diane Ragsdale, who passed away very suddenly in early January. And she and I had been thinking together on a regular basis for like the last 4, 5, 6 years. We worked together at the Banff Center and their cultural leadership program, and then more recently we worked together at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, where she was the director of the Creative Leadership Master's program that was truly putting into practice a lot of these very forward-thinking arts-based methodologies, developing leadership capacities for a future world. I really believe that the program that exists there and the ideas that are behind it, this is the program that 5 years from now, 7 years from now, 10 years from now, people will have wished that they understood 10 years ago. That these are the new capacities that we need to develop. And so, in trying to write at this point, my thinking is so infused with our collaboration, with our shared thinking, which was really around relational leadership and world making. And so I'm making my best attempt to honor her and us in this writing and the work that we had been doing together, and trying to name what these capacities are, trying to articulate the methodologies in progress, and to try to make clear the why behind this. And I think that's really, from an embodiment perspective, I really see the way this world that was, or the world that's ending, is such a disembodied world. It's a world that divides, head from body. It doesn't acknowledge that we are bodies. It doesn't acknowledge that we think with and through our bodies, that we make sense and meaning of the world through relational interactions. And so this is a paradigmatic shift in terms of a shift into a new world. It's not an innovation strategy that's going to, find more efficiencies in a world that we already understand. It's a shift away from a world that we have understood to a world that we are making, a world that is in the making. And so, so this is my current project. This is what I'm trying to write about now. Why do we need to do this? What are these new capacities, and why we can't go back? Why we can't double down on past ways. And these are, this doubling down is something that I'm sensing is happening in the world right now. This the emergency strategy is still very active. And I spoke about that in my first essay, the difference between emergency and emergence. And I feel like a lot of organizations are in emergency mode right now and really trying to hang on tightly to the familiar and what they know. And I also kind of understand. I kind of understand why. Like when we're in distress, we're not in this expansive mode of trying to learn and embrace new ways. And I think this is like why we need artists who are working outside of these institutional structures, who can imagine and work with these expansive creative ideas and practices, because this is going to be the bridge. This is going to, like, as this old world falls away and as these familiar strategies work less and less and less and less, someone has to be attending to what's next. Someone has to be attending to the emergent world. And so my hope is that artists will be mobilized to do this.
You're making me cry. Well, in the sense that there's a mix of joy and sadness, right, in this work and hearing your words, because there's young people who will inherit this world,
Mm-hmm.
and they will say, well, what did you do to prepare for it? And I think we are doing things. But in the paper that's not published, you do talk about Brian Eno, and I like that
Mm-hmm.
quote because he I can't remember it all, but it was something about how until you can imagine or see what that new world looks like, it's really hard to actually, literally have it in your mind. And artists do that all the time. They always
Mm-hmm.
have.
Yeah.
And sometimes they get, sidetracked in fascism or something terrible. But mostly there's a sense of reflection and also feeling,
Yeah.
being a key word, ways of life. Sometimes they're very ancient ways of life, indigenous all around the world, ways of being that are very profound and are proven to work, right, because they're sustainable and they're beautiful. So I think we all have to be involved in a process of co-creation, of humility, of healing everywhere. And the more local, the better, because that's where we are, like presence. That's why this thing called a calm presence I'm starting to write about is how can we be present in this time in a way that is both mournful and grieving the losses and joyful about the future, which is already here, because there is no such thing as a future.
That's right.
Where we are, blah, blah, blah.
Yes. Well, I think you make a really beautiful point in that, and I think this is something that I'm also coming to, that when we allow ourselves to be really present with all that is, it's painful. And it's not only painful, but it is painful, and ignoring that and circumventing a process of grieving that I think all of us need to engage with. Like, even if you didn't lose someone in your world through the pandemic, there has been a profound loss of the familiar. And that is this change, this flux, this accelerated flux that we're all in. I think it does warrant some reflection. And, in some ways we had a period of self-reflexivity during the pandemic lockdowns, right? But there is also, like, that process doesn't end now that we're all, like, back out in the world. Like, it
Consuming
continues.
like mad.
Yeah, it continues. And I think we do need to connect to this feeling of our aliveness. And I mean, for me, the hope comes, like, I have so much faith in human beings, because I think that we do feel what's happening, even if we can't articulate it, even if we don't quite know what to do, even if we're a bit caught in the hamster wheel of our lives. I think we do feel what is happening. And I think if we really tap into that feeling, we know a different world is possible. We know when we are visiting with our friends around a dinner table, and we know when we're taking a walk out in nature, and we know when we're, having a moment of connection with our own feelings, when we're in, joyful, intimate connection with the relationships around us. Like, I think that those are the places where we know a better world is possible, because that's when we're feeling those moments of joy, we're feeling those moments of connection. And they are important. They rise in importance in our world above all the other dynamics that are around us, and maybe weighing on us and contributing to our burnout, or contributing to a feeling of disconnection. That there's always something in our world that helps us feel what is possible, feel our aliveness. And so that's where I am placing my hope.
Well, good. I didn't have to ask you the hope question then. So to end, I ask my guests, you read a lot and you see a lot of things, but is there something that comes to mind that you would recommend that's really a good thing to see or read these days?
Oh my goodness.
I didn't ask you to prepare, but it's
okay.
I'm sure there's something that comes to mind.
Well, maybe I'll make two offers. This is like, without giving it much thought, really, these are just two books that one I just started reading, another that I just finished. So I just finished reading a book called Embodied Activism, and the author is Ray Johnson. I followed Ray's work for some time and actually took their course on embodied activism during the pandemic. And if you're at all interested in embodiment and how embodied practice lives in the world of, when we think about social justice, this book, like, I am, in reading it, and I've read a lot, of course, on embodiment, I'm just really floored by the way Ray can take, complex ideas, like from the phenomenology of perception, some of these foundational academic texts, and just really frame it in layperson's terms. It's not a long text. I think it's just over 200 pages, maybe not even 200 pages. So I highly recommend that one, Embodied Activism. And then the other one is not such a new text. I have just I'm delighted to be reading this in this moment, which is the one called Rest is Resistance. And this is, sort of what we were talking about too, how slowing down and feeling all by itself is an act of resistance, because it starts to push back against this sort of capitalist white supremacy culture that insists on the hustle, that insists on the doing, and it's an invitation into being. So I've started reading this in just little bits before I go to sleep, and it's just really resonating with me right now. But it's not a new book. It's been out for a while, but that one, Rest is Resistance.
Well, thanks for everything. It's a pleasure to have this second conversation. I'm sure there will be more. And let's talk again.
Thank you so much, Claude.